Daniel Cross was the kind of man everyone feared in the office. He was tall, confident, and always dressed in an expensive suit. His shoes shined like mirrors, and his wristwatch cost more than some of his employees made in a year. To many, he looked like the perfect image of success, smart, rich, and powerful. But behind that polished image, Daniel had something darker, a heart full of pride and arrogance. Daniel was the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the city. He had built the company from almost nothing, starting in a small apartment with only 2 people working for him. That success story made him believe he was smarter than everyone else. Over time, his confidence turned into ego. He began to think that no one could challenge him, and no one could ever be as good as he was. Every morning, Daniel walked into the office with his head held high, not to greet anyone, but to remind them who was in charge. His employees used to smile nervously when he passed by, pretending to be busy on their computers. They all knew one thing. If Daniel saw you doing something he didn't like, even for a moment, your job could be gone in seconds. He liked control. He liked power. He liked the feeling that people were afraid of him. To Daniel, fear was respect. He often told his managers, if they fear you, they'll never fail you. And so the office was always silent when he entered, as if everyone was holding their breath. One thing Daniel could not stand was imperfection. He wanted everything spotless and every desk clean, every paper in its place, every meeting starting exactly on time. If someone was 5 minutes late, he made them explain in front of everyone. He believed he was setting high standards, but in truth he was only showing how little kindness he had left. The janitorial staff, the security guards, and the receptionists were invisible to him. He never said good morning or thank you to them. In his mind, they were not important. He often thought, they're lucky to even work in my company. When someone once suggested that he should learn everyone's names, Daniel laughed and said, why should I remember people who can be replaced tomorrow? But what Daniel didn't know was that this arrogance was slowly destroying him, not financially but emotionally. He had no real friends. People around him only said what he wanted to hear. They agreed with him, laughed at his jokes, and praised his ideas even when he was wrong. Deep down, Daniel was alone, surrounded by people who only respected his money, not his character. One Monday morning, Daniel arrived at the office earlier than usual. His assistant, nervous as always, rushed to greet him. Good morning, Mr. Cross, she said, handing him his coffee. But Daniel didn't respond. He was already angry because he had seen a small stain near the elevator, a spilled cup of coffee that someone hadn't cleaned yet. Who's responsible for this mess? He shouted, his voice echoing through the hallway. His assistant tried to calm him down, saying the janitor was on his way. But Daniel didn't care. To him, it was a sign of carelessness, a sign that people weren't working hard enough. He walked straight into his office, slammed the door, and muttered, if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. In meetings, Daniel spoke more than he listened. Whenever someone offered a new idea, he interrupted them halfway. If a junior employee made a small mistake, Daniel would raise his voice and embarrass them in front of everyone. His managers often exchanged silent looks, wishing someone would stand up to him, but no one dared. He was too powerful, and no one wanted to lose their job. Outside the office, Daniel's life wasn't much better. He lived in a huge penthouse apartment with a view of the city, but it always felt empty. He had expensive furniture, luxury cars, and the latest technology, but not a single person who truly cared about him. His phone was full of business contacts, but there was no one he could call just to talk. Sometimes, late at night, Daniel looked at old photos of himself. A young, smiling man who once dreamed of creating something meaningful, but now all he had built was fear. He didn't realize it yet, but his empire was fragile. It looked strong from the outside, but it was built on shaky ground, on arrogance, not respect. In the company cafeteria, employees often whispered stories about Daniel's temper. Some said he had fired a man just for disagreeing with him during a meeting. Others said he once threw a document across the room because a report had a small typo. Everyone knew that working under him was like walking on eggshells. Still, Daniel didn't care what people said. He believed that fear kept people productive. What he didn't know was that fear also kills loyalty. And soon, life would teach him that lesson in a way he would never forget. Because somewhere in that same office worked a quiet, older man who everyone called Bob. a janitor with kind eyes and steady hands. Daniel had never looked twice at him, never said hello, never learned his name. To him, Bob was just another cleaner. But Bob was far more than that. Daniel's arrogance was about to meet something stronger, the quiet strength of a man who had seen war, loss, and life itself. And when that day came, Daniel Cross's perfect world would never look the same again. The next morning, the office was unusually quiet. People spoke softly, afraid to disturb the calm before the storm. Everyone knew how the CEO, Daniel Cross, could explode over the smallest mistake. But in the middle of all that tension, one man worked peacefully. The janitor, Robert Bob Hayes. Bob had worked in the company for almost 3 years. Every morning he arrived before sunrise wearing the same dark blue uniform, his name stitched in white thread over his heart. He carried a small lunchbox, an old thermos, and a smile that never seemed to fade. While others rushed in half asleep, checking their phones and complaining about traffic, Bob quietly began his work, sweeping, wiping, polishing, and like an artist taking care of his canvas. To most people, Bob was invisible. Employees passed him in the hall without a glance. The managers never spoke to him unless there was a complaint. Yet Bob never seemed to mind. He hummed softly while cleaning, sometimes old country songs, sometimes something that sounded like military tunes. There was something calm and steady about him, like nothing in the world could shake him. But behind that calmness was a life few could imagine. Years ago, before the uniform and the mop, Bob had worn a very different uniform, the camouflage of a Special Forces soldier. He had served his country for more than 20 years. He had seen deserts, jungles, and war zones. He had led men through darkness, rescued hostages, and fought battles that never made the news. He had medals locked away in a small box at home, medals he never showed anyone. For him, those were not symbols of pride, so they were reminders of people he had lost. When his service ended, Bob didn't chase glory or recognition. He just wanted peace. He wanted a normal life, away from gunfire, away from pain. So he moved to the city and took a simple job, cleaning floors, fixing things, and living quietly. To Bob, work was work. No job was too small or beneath him. He believed that dignity came from effort, not titles. While others saw mopping floors as a lowly task, he saw it as an act of discipline and service. He had once led missions to save lives. Now he simply kept spaces clean so others could work safely. It didn't matter. Both, in his eyes, were forms of responsibility. One day, a young intern named Megan stayed late at the office. She accidentally spilled her coffee and apologized when Bob appeared with his mop. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Hayes," she said shyly. Bob smiled. "Don't worry, miss. Accidents happen. That's why I'm here." She watched him for a moment as he cleaned up quietly and then asked, "Why do you always seem so calm? Everyone else here looks so stressed." Bob chuckled softly. "Well," he said, "when you've seen worse days, you learn not to let little things bother you." She didn't understand what he meant, but she smiled anyway. There was something reassuring about his voice, like talking to someone who had lived through storms and still found peace afterward. Bob never talked much about his past, but sometimes when the office was empty, he would pause and stare out the window, not at the city lights, but at the horizon. His eyes seemed distant, filled with memories that belonged to another world. Despite his quietness, the security guards liked him. They said he moved like a soldier, and precise, alert, and aware of everything around him. Once, when a power outage hit the building at night, everyone panicked. But Bob stayed calm. He guided people out of dark stairways, found emergency flashlights, and helped the guards restore order. No one realized it, but his training had kicked in. He handled the situation better than anyone else. Still, even after moments like that, Daniel Cross never noticed him. To the CEO, Bob was just part of the background, someone whose name wasn't worth remembering. On that same morning when Daniel shouted about the coffee stain, Bob was the one who came rushing with a bucket and mop. He had been helping a delivery man fix a jammed elevator when the call came over the intercom. Without complaint, he hurried upstairs. By the time he arrived, Daniel was already fuming. His face was red, his voice sharp like broken glass. Bob began cleaning quietly, but before he could even finish, Daniel turned on him. "What took you so long?" the CEO barked. "I'm sorry, sir," Bob said calmly. "There was a delivery stuck downstairs. I came as fast as I could." Daniel's eyes narrowed. Excuses. Always excuses. You people can't even do a simple job, right? Bob didn't answer. He just kept cleaning, his hands steady, his expression unchanged. Years in the field had taught him that reacting to anger only made things worse. He finished his work silently and stood up, ready to leave. Daniel pointed toward the door. "You're done here," he said coldly. "Get your things and go. I don't need lazy people in my company." Everyone in the hallway froze. No one dared to speak. The janitor simply nodded, placed the mop back in the bucket, and walked away without a word. What no one saw was the faint sadness in his eyes, not because he lost the job, but because he had seen that kind of arrogance before many times, in people who thought power made them untouchable. As Bob left the building, the morning sun hit his face. He stopped for a moment, took a deep breath, and whispered to himself, "Some people learn respect the hard way." Then, he smiled faintly and walked down the street, the same steady walk of a soldier who never runs, never fears, and never forgets who he is. What Bob didn't know was that his quiet exit would soon become the biggest turning point in Daniel Cross's life, one that would change everything he believed about power, respect, and what it truly means to lead. The morning after Bob was fired, the office felt different. It was the same shiny building, the same glass doors, the same busy workers pretending everything was fine, but something had changed. People whispered quietly near the coffee machines. The janitor's corner downstairs was empty. The bucket and mop were gone. For the first time in 3 years, the hallway floors didn't have their usual shine. No one dared to say it out loud, but everyone knew what had happened. The CEO, Daniel Cross, had fired Bob Hayes, the kindest man in the building, right in front of everyone. Some said it was unfair, others said it was typical Daniel. Either way, no one was surprised. Daniel's temper was famous, and Bob had simply been the latest victim of it. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't think much about it. To him, it was just another morning. Another employee who didn't meet his standards. He believed he had done the right thing. In his mind, firing lazy or slow workers was part of leadership. He sat in his office, sipping his espresso, scrolling through his emails, completely unaware that the man he had just fired was no ordinary janitor. Later that day, a new cleaning worker arrived, young, nervous, and unfamiliar with the place. She struggled with the heavy cleaning cart, bumping it into walls and leaving streaks on the glass doors. Daniel noticed this while walking past and frowned. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. For the first time, he missed how spotless the floors used to be, though he didn't admit it. Meanwhile, downstairs in the security room, a man named Mark Jensen was reviewing staff updates. Mark was the head of security, a disciplined and serious man in his 40s. When he saw the termination list, his eyes froze. He stared at the name, at Robert Hayes. He knew that name. Not from the company, but from years ago. Mark had once served in the army, and the name Robert Hayes wasn't one you could forget. He quickly opened his computer and searched through his old military contacts. Within minutes, he found what he was looking for. Sergeant Major Robert Hayes, retired Special Forces recipient of multiple honors, including the Silver Star and Distinguished Service Medal. Mark leaned back in his chair, speechless. "There's no way," he whispered. The humble janitor, the man who quietly cleaned the floors every day and never raised his voice, the same man who had once led soldiers into battle. He grabbed his phone and called Daniel's office. "Sir, I need to speak with you immediately." "It's important," he said. Daniel sighed. "Mark, unless it's a security threat, I'm in the middle of—" "It's about the janitor, Robert Hayes." That caught Daniel's attention. He leaned forward. "What about him?" Mark hesitated for a second. "Sir, I don't think you know who you just fired." Within minutes, Mark walked into Daniel's office carrying a printed file. He placed it on the CEO's desk without a word. Daniel opened it, expecting some HR issue. But when he saw the photos and documents inside, his expression slowly changed. There it was, a younger version of the man he had humiliated, in full uniform, surrounded by soldiers. Reports of missions, medals, and commendations filled the pages. Daniel kept reading, his face turning pale. He was in the Special Forces. He asked quietly. Mark nodded. "Yes, sir. One of the best. He trained men who now serve in top intelligence units. He saved lives. He's a hero." For the first time in years, Daniel was speechless. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the photo of Bob. The same man he had called useless just a day ago. His chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in a long time, guilt. How could I not know? He muttered. Mark looked at him seriously. Because you never asked, sir. You never looked. That sentence hit Daniel like a punch. He couldn't focus for the rest of the day. The image of Bob's calm face wouldn't leave his mind. The way Bob had stood there quietly, not arguing, not defending himself. Now it all made sense. That silence wasn't weakness. It was strength. That evening, Daniel sat alone in his office as the city lights flickered outside the window. His reflection stared back at him, the proud CEO who thought he knew everything. But now he saw something else. A man who had judged someone by their uniform, not their character. For the first time, Daniel felt small. He realized that power wasn't just about control. It was about respect, something he had never truly given anyone. He stayed late that night, walking through the empty halls. Every corner reminded him of the man who had once cleaned it. He noticed small things. How the carpets now looked dusty, how the bins weren't emptied, how the silence felt colder without Bob humming his quiet tunes. By the time Daniel left the building, the guilt had grown heavier. He sat in his car for a while, staring at the city skyline, wondering where Bob was. He didn't know how to find him, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to make things right. What Daniel didn't realize was that this was just the beginning. Fate was already setting the stage for their paths to cross again, not as boss and janitor, but as two men standing face to face, one seeking forgiveness, and the other holding the quiet strength of a soldier who had already forgiven long before the apology came. Daniel Cross didn't sleep well that night. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on him. His penthouse apartment was quiet, but the silence only made the thoughts louder. The image of Bob Hayes' calm face, the way he had stood silently while being humiliated, refused to leave him. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the office earlier than usual. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a strange tension. His assistant noticed it immediately. "Good morning, sir," she said hesitantly, sensing the unease in his voice. Daniel nodded but didn't speak. He walked past the desks, past the nervous employees, and stopped at the security office. Mark Jensen, the head of security, was waiting. He had spent the night thinking about what to do. He knew Daniel was a proud man, a man who never admitted mistakes easily. But Mark also knew that Daniel needed the truth in the clearest possible way. "Sir," Mark began cautiously, "I think you need to see this." He handed Daniel a small folder. Daniel opened it slowly, almost afraid of what he might find. Inside were photographs of Bob in his younger years, tall, strong, and in full military gear. There were newspaper clippings, awards, and certificates of bravery. One picture showed Bob leading a squad, pointing confidently in the middle of a dense jungle. Another showed him receiving a medal for courage in front of a national audience. Daniel's hands trembled slightly. He stared at the images, trying to reconcile them with the man he had yelled at the day before, the quiet janitor, the invisible worker, the one he had called useless. He couldn't believe it. He's a retired Special Forces operative? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir," Mark replied. "Decorated, highly trained, and one of the best. This man's record is extraordinary, and you just fired him yesterday." Daniel closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. A mix of shock, guilt, and disbelief churned inside him. He had always judged people by their appearances, by their titles, by what they seemed to be on the surface. And yet here was a man who had dedicated his life to courage, discipline, and service. And Daniel had treated him like a nobody. Mark watched him silently. "Sir, I know it's hard to accept, but this is the truth. And it's never too late to do the right thing." Daniel nodded slowly, but words failed him. He could feel the consequences of his arrogance pressing down. All the little moments he had ignored Bob. The mornings he walked past him without a greeting. The times he had scolded him for minor things. The general disregard he had shown. All of it rushed back. He remembered the moment Bob had simply nodded and left the room without arguing. That calm, quiet strength that Daniel had dismissed as weakness now felt like a personal rebuke. Daniel realized that in his arrogance, he had underestimated not just Bob, but the value of humility, discipline, and honor. For hours that day, Daniel couldn't focus on work. Every decision, every spreadsheet, every meeting felt meaningless compared to the realization he had just had. The company he had built with ambition and ruthlessness suddenly felt empty without respect, without loyalty, without people who mattered. Meanwhile, Bob went about his day quietly. He didn't know that the man who had fired him was now sitting in his office, staring at his pictures, grappling with the truth. Bob had learned long ago not to let arrogance or insults affect him. Life had taught him patience, restraint, and the power of silence. And now his silence was teaching Daniel a lesson, one Daniel would never forget. Later that afternoon, Daniel called Mark again. "I need to find him," he said urgently. "I need to apologize, and maybe I need to learn something from him too." Mark nodded, handing him a piece of paper. "I have his address. He volunteers at a veterans center most afternoons. But sir, remember, Bob isn't looking for recognition or praise. He doesn't care about titles or power. If you want to speak to him, you need to approach him with respect. Nothing else." Daniel took the paper, holding it like it was a lifeline. For the first time in years, he felt small, humbled, and aware of the consequences of his actions. He realized that respect could not be commanded. It could only be earned. And if he wanted it now, he would have to start by acknowledging the truth about someone he had dismissed too quickly. That evening, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Bob. He pictured him quietly mopping the floors, humming softly, moving with purpose and calm precision. He imagined the Veterans Center, the quiet smiles of men and women who had served, and how Bob gave them guidance, training, and hope. Daniel knew that approaching Bob wouldn't be easy. He had been arrogant for so long, and Bob's life had been shaped by experiences far beyond anything Daniel could understand. But he also knew that this was a chance, maybe the only chance he would ever get, to face his mistakes and try to make amends. As Daniel left the office that night, the city lights reflected off the glass windows, but none of it mattered to him. His mind was already planning, already imagining what he would say, how he would act. One thing was certain: the hidden truth about Bob Hayes had changed him, forever, and somewhere quiet and unaware, Bob continued his work, cleaning, helping, serving, his life a lesson in humility, discipline, and quiet strength. The day of reckoning was coming, and Daniel Cross would soon learn that true respect is never given lightly, and power alone cannot teach a man what courage and honor truly mean. Daniel Cross drove through the city streets with a strange mix of anxiety and determination. The bright neon lights reflected off the windshield, but his mind wasn't on traffic or deadlines. It was on one person, Bob Hayes, the man he had fired, the quiet janitor who turned out to be a decorated Special Forces operative. He had rehearsed the conversation countless times in his head. What do you say to someone like Bob? How do you apologize to a man who had never asked for recognition, who had served with courage beyond imagination, and who had faced far greater challenges than any CEO boardroom? Daniel didn't know, but he knew he had to try. When he arrived at the Veterans Center, the smell of coffee, old books, and faintly polished floors greeted him. Bob was there, quietly supervising a small group of young veterans practicing basic drills. His movements were precise, calm, almost hypnotic in their discipline. Every command he gave was measured, and every correction came with patience, not anger. Daniel stepped into the room, his heart pounding. The chatter stopped when the veterans noticed the visitor. Bob, sensing a new presence, turned slowly. His eyes, calm yet piercing, locked onto Daniel's. In that instant, Daniel felt exposed. All the arrogance, pride, and false authority he had carried for years vanished. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He was just a man standing before another man who could see through him without a word. "Mr. Hayes," Daniel said, his voice low, I need to apologize. I was wrong. About everything." Bob studied him for a moment, his face unreadable. Then he nodded slightly, signaling Daniel to continue. "I treated you poorly. I didn't know who you were. I didn't appreciate what you've done, not just for the company, but for this country. For people like these." Daniel gestured toward the veterans practicing behind them. I let my arrogance blind me. I called you names. I humiliated you, and I want to make it right." Bob didn't smile or speak immediately. He crossed his arms, his posture calm but firm, like a tree that had weathered countless storms. Finally, he said, "Respect isn't something you give because someone is afraid of you, Daniel, and it's not something you can buy with apologies. It's earned through actions." Daniel swallowed hard. I know that now. I've realized that power without respect is meaningless. I've learned the hard way. Bob's eyes softened slightly. You've learned, yes. But learning isn't enough. You have to act differently. You have to treat people with dignity, even when it doesn't benefit you, even when they're invisible to the world. Daniel nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. For the first time, he understood the depth of Bob's strength. He had trained soldiers, faced impossible missions, and risked his life countless times. And yet, here he was, teaching life lessons to people who had already been through so much. That was power. Quiet, unassuming, unshakable power. I want to make amends, Bob, Daniel said earnestly. I want you to come back to the company, not as a janitor, but as someone who can teach others what I'm only now starting to understand. Leadership, discipline, respect. I need your guidance. Bob remained silent for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. I don't do this for titles or money. I do it to make a difference. If that's what you want, Daniel, then we'll see what we can do. But know this. Nothing here will change unless you genuinely change. Daniel exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and humility. This was not just a second chance for Bob to return. It was a second chance for him to rebuild, to lead differently, to understand that respect is never commanded, it's earned. The veterans around them continued their drills, unaware of the silent, powerful exchange that had just taken place. Daniel realized that he had been given something far more valuable than any business strategy or boardroom victory. He had been given a lesson in humility, strength, and humanity. As Bob continued to oversee the drills, Daniel asked, Can you teach me? Can you help me fix what I've broken, not just in the company, but in the way I treat people? Bob glanced at him, then back at the young veterans. I can try, he said simply. But remember, Daniel, real change takes time, and it has to come from within you, not from fear, not from titles, from who you are inside. Daniel nodded again, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He realized that the confrontation he had feared wasn't about conflict or punishment. It was about truth, and the truth he now understood had the power to change everything. Before leaving the center, Daniel shook Bob's hand. It was firm, quiet, and steady, a handshake that spoke more than words ever could. And in that moment, Daniel knew that his life and the life of his company would never be the same again. Walking out into the evening air, Daniel felt a strange mixture of humility, awe, and hope. For the first time, he was beginning to understand that leadership wasn't about fear or control. It was about courage, patience, and respect. And the man who had taught him that, the quiet janitor, the retired Special Forces operative, was no ordinary hero. He was a living reminder of what true strength really meant. The next morning, Daniel Cross arrived at the office with a sense he hadn't felt in years. Unease mixed with purpose. The usual rush of authority, the swagger he carried like armor, was gone. Instead, there was a quiet tension in his chest, a realization that he had to do more than apologize. He had to change. As he stepped into the lobby, the polished floors seemed duller, the air heavier. Daniel noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The peeling paint on the stairwell, the dusty vents in the corners, the tired eyes of employees glued to their screens. For years he had ignored these small signs, believing efficiency meant productivity, not well-being. But now, with Bob Hayes' lessons echoing in his mind, he felt the weight of his ignorance. Daniel spent the first hour walking the hallways, observing quietly. He didn't speak to anyone at first, just watched. He saw a receptionist nervously answering phones, a delivery boy struggling with heavy boxes, and a software engineer visibly stressed over a missed deadline. Each small struggle felt magnified now, a reminder of how his arrogance had created fear and discomfort instead of respect and support. By mid-morning, he called an impromptu meeting with his managers. His voice was calm, measured, almost hesitant, a stark contrast to the booming, demanding tones they were used to. We're going to do things differently, he said. Starting today, respect comes first. Mistakes are learning opportunities, not punishments. And I want every one of you to think about how you treat your team, not just results. There was silence in the room. Managers exchanged nervous glances, unsure if this was a genuine shift or another momentary whim. But Daniel's tone, the honesty in his eyes, made them pause. Something was different. This was not the CEO they feared. This was a man who had seen the consequences of arrogance, and he wanted to rebuild from the ground up. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself standing in front of the new janitor, a young woman struggling to lift a bucket of cleaning solution. Without thinking, he walked over and offered to help. "Here, let me give you a hand," he said. She looked surprised, and for the first time she saw the CEO not as a distant, untouchable figure, but as a human being. Daniel noticed the gratitude in her eyes. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it hit him hard. This was respect in action, noticing people, helping them, valuing their efforts. He realized he had spent so many years chasing efficiency and results that he had forgotten the simplest truth. People matter more than productivity. By the end of the day, Daniel requested a meeting with Mark Jensen. "I want Bob back," he said quietly. "Not just in the building, but here, helping us learn. I need him to teach me, and everyone else, what leadership really means." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" Daniel nodded. "I've never been more serious in my life. I need guidance. Not from books, not from charts, but from someone who knows discipline, courage, and respect firsthand." Meanwhile, Bob continued his work at the Veterans Center, unaware of the small but significant changes happening in the office. He focused on training young veterans, showing them that patience, humility, and consistency were just as important as strength and skill. Bob had long believed that people like Daniel might never change, but he also knew that when someone truly recognizes their mistakes, change could begin, even in the proudest of men. The next week, Daniel implemented small but deliberate changes. He started greeting everyone personally in the morning, asking about their well-being, and even joining in small tasks, helping set up meeting rooms, carrying boxes, and checking in on maintenance staff. At first, employees were hesitant, unsure if this was genuine, but over time they began to notice the difference. Conversations felt lighter, laughter returned to the hallways, and people started speaking openly without fear. During this period, Daniel also reflected on his own life outside the office. He realized that arrogance had cost him relationships, friendships, and genuine connections. The lesson he had learned from Bob extended far beyond the walls of the company. Humility, patience, and respect were essential, not just in leadership, but in life itself. By the end of the week, Daniel finally reached out to Bob personally. He invited him to the office not as a janitor, but as a mentor and leadership coach. Daniel's heart pounded as he waited for Bob's arrival. He knew that this moment would be another turning point, one that could either solidify his transformation or test his sincerity. When Bob walked through the doors, calm and composed, Daniel felt a mix of awe and gratitude. He approached him with humility, extending his hand. "Welcome back," he said simply. "I'm ready to learn." Bob studied him silently for a moment, then shook his hand firmly. "Actions speak louder than words," he replied. "Let's see if you're ready." And in that handshake, Daniel felt a shift deep within him, a recognition that true leadership was not about power or fear, but about humility, respect, and the courage to change. For the first time, he knew that his journey had truly begun, and that Bob Hayes, the quiet, disciplined, heroic janitor, would be the guide who helped him walk it. The morning Bob returned to the office, the air felt different, lighter, charged with quiet anticipation. Employees whispered behind their hands, unsure of what to expect. Daniel walked ahead, holding the door open, but it was Bob who commanded attention without trying. He moved calmly through the lobby, his presence quiet yet undeniable, like someone who didn't need power to be respected, because respect followed him naturally. Daniel felt nervous, a strange unfamiliarity settling in his chest. He had spent years feeling untouchable, in control, commanding fear and obedience. But standing next to Bob, he felt vulnerable and, strangely, grateful. This man, the one he had once humiliated, was about to teach him what true leadership meant. Bob didn't waste time with greetings or pleasantries. He immediately walked the floors, observing, noting what needed attention. His eyes caught the small details Daniel had always overlooked: the worn chairs in the break room, the frayed edges of stairwell carpeting, the overfilled trash bins. But instead of scolding anyone, Bob quietly guided the staff. "Keep the floors clear here," he said softly to a cleaning assistant. "But make sure to check the vents too. Dust can build faster than you think." He moved on, correcting a small mistake in the printer setup. Nothing harsh, nothing condescending. Every instruction was calm, deliberate and infused with respect. Even Daniel noticed it. Bob could command attention and action without raising his voice. He could lead with authority and still inspire loyalty. That afternoon, Daniel gathered the management team in the conference room. "I want Bob to work with all of us," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "Not just for training sessions, but for mentorship. He's here to teach us about discipline, respect, and leadership." Bob stepped forward, his calm gaze sweeping the room. "Leadership isn't about titles or fear," he said. "It's about how you treat people when no one is watching. It's about humility, patience, and the courage to admit mistakes. And it starts with you, each of you, starting today." The managers listened, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They had never heard a CEO humbled like this, and now they were being challenged to rethink their own behavior. Bob continued, walking the room slowly, making eye contact with each person. "A company is more than profits. It's the people who make it run. And if those people feel invisible, disrespected, or afraid, the company will never reach its true potential." Daniel watched silently, realizing how much he had failed in his own office. The arrogance that once defined him now seemed small, even foolish. Bob wasn't just cleaning floors anymore. He was rebuilding the foundation of the company from the inside out. Over the next few weeks, the change was palpable. Daniel stopped barking orders. He began walking through the hallways, greeting employees, listening to their concerns, and even helping with small tasks. The staff noticed the shift immediately. Laughter returned to the lunchroom. Teams started collaborating openly. The fear that once hovered over every decision began to lift. Bob held training sessions, but they were unlike anything the company had experienced before. He didn't lecture. He demonstrated. He guided exercises in discipline, patience, and respect. He taught managers how to listen, how to empower their teams, and how to lead without intimidation. Slowly, a new culture emerged, one rooted in trust and mutual respect rather than fear and compliance. One day, a young intern accidentally dropped a stack of important files. The tension in the room could have been suffocating, but Bob simply stepped in, calmly organizing the mess while offering guidance. "Mistakes happen," he said. "How you respond defines you, not the mistake itself." Daniel observed from across the room, silently taking notes. He realized that this was the essence of leadership he had been missing all these years: empathy, patience, and the ability to uplift others rather than tear them down. By the end of the month, the company felt transformed. Employees began volunteering ideas, managers held open-door sessions, and even small tasks were approached with newfound care. Daniel noticed something he had never considered before. Productivity and respect were not at odds. In fact, respect made productivity soar. Bob never sought recognition for his efforts. He walked the halls quietly, observing, correcting, guiding. But everyone noticed the shift, and slowly, gratitude filled the office. Gratitude for his wisdom, for his quiet authority, and for the lessons he imparted every day. One evening, Daniel stayed late in his office looking out at the city skyline. He reflected on the journey that had begun with his arrogance and Bob's quiet strength. He realized that he had been given a rare gift, the chance to see the world through someone else's eyes, to understand the power of humility, and to transform not just his leadership but his life. Later, Daniel approached Bob as he finished his rounds. "I don't know how to thank you," he said honestly. "You've changed everything, me, the company, even the way I see people." Bob smiled faintly, the calm strength in his eyes unwavering. "Actions, Daniel." "Don't thank me. Show it every day. Treat people right. That's enough." And in that simple exchange, Daniel understood the depth of Bob's teaching. The quiet janitor, the retired Special Forces operative, had become the catalyst for a new era, not only for the company, but for Daniel himself. The redemption wasn't just Bob's, it was Daniel's too. And as he watched Bob leave for the evening, humming softly while carrying his cleaning supplies, Daniel realized the truth he had finally learned. True leadership is earned through respect, humility, and the courage to change.